A Lutheran colleague of mine once said to me with genuine wonder and sympathy in her voice, "It must really be hard being a Unitarian Universalist minister at Easter." Of course, I replied, "It's always hard being a Unitarian Universalist minister, but it's also exciting and challenging and deeply fulfilling, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." But I wondered, what unique difficulty did she imagine me having? Did she think I would find myself standing here on Easter morning all dressed up with nothing to say? She knew that I had a lot to say. That wasn't my problem. If anything, my problem was the opposite, that I had too much to say and that I might feel like I had to say it all on this one day. She told me that for her, as a Christian minister preaching to a Christian congregation, every Sunday was a little Easter. So there wasn't all that pressure to get it said all on one day. In traditional Christian churches, the spirit of Easter is distributed throughout the year in little pieces like brightly colored jelly beans marking the path to go. In most Unitarian Universalist congregations, that's not the case. So Easter takes on a paradoxically heightened significance. After all, it may be our one chance to say something about Jesus. I'm reminded of a story about a Vermont farmer who goes to a small village church on a Sunday morning and finds that he's the only one there except for the preacher. And the minister asks, "Well, what do you think, Wendell? Do you want me to go ahead and preach?" "Well," said the farmer, "if I went out to the barn and found only one cow there, I'd still feed that cow." And the preacher gets the hint and starts his sermon, which went on and on and on for over an hour. And when it was finally finished, he asked the farmer, "Well, Wendell, what did you think?" "Well," said the farmer, "like I said, if I found only one cow in the barn, I would feed her. But I wouldn't feed her all the hay in the barn. So I'm not going to try to feed you all the hay in the barn this morning. I want to resist that temptation to try to say everything about Easter in this one sermon. It's a big story. And I'm going to focus instead on just one tiny little aspect of it, but I think a critical image, and that is the image of the empty tomb. I think that the empty tomb has a legitimate claim to being the original Christian symbol, even more primordial than the symbol of the cross. Of course, the death of Jesus by crucifixion was a necessary presupposition for the Easter story, so in that sense, the cross comes first. But the cross was a Roman symbol, an emblem of imperial power, and it was forced upon the early Christian community without their consent. It was simply a fact of life, or rather a fact of death, and they had to make do with it as a reality that cast its shadow over their world. This cruel instrument of torture simply had to be included as in the story because, as a matter of historical fact, it was there. The empty tomb, on the other hand, I will suggest is significant precisely because of what wasn't there. It is a product, the symbol, the image, the story of the empty tomb was a product of the Christian imagination. It was a mythic creation of the early storytellers and gospel writers. It was a symbol carved out of the collective unconscious of the emerging Christian community. It was the ultimate parable. In other words, I do not think that the empty tomb was a historical event. If video cameras had been on the scene, they wouldn't have captured anything unusual, no body snatching or medical miracles. Instead, the symbol and story of the empty tomb was a later attempt to reflect back upon the meaning and significance of Jesus' life and death, and to express that meaning and significance in symbolic terms. Just as the Christmas stories were historically grounded, but fictionalized and richly symbolic retrospective accounts of the Nativity, so too the Easter stories are historical fictions undoubtedly influenced by what actually happened, but more importantly, they are carefully crafted parables that are meant to convey a spiritual message. The one who taught in parables becomes himself a parable to be told. Their parabolic nature doesn't detract from the symbolic power of these stories. On the contrary, you'll never hear me saying that something is just a symbol. Symbols pack power, immense power. So if the story of the empty tomb is a later literary creation, what really happened, historically speaking? We can never know for sure, of course. John Dominic Crossan, a Roman Catholic New Testament scholar, contends that Jesus was probably buried along with many others in an unmarked mass grave, and that his corpse was picked clean by scavenging dogs. Now that may seem like an example of in-your-face scholarship designed to shock, to rudely awaken the church from its dogmatic slumber, but it is based on sound academic and archaeological research. Crossan is one of the world's most respected New Testament scholars, the co-founder along with Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar. According to Crossan, then, Easter was not a single event, but a gradual process. It was a dawning awareness that took years, even decades, to develop. Indeed, the meanings of Easter are still evolving. It's not something that happened once upon a time, long ago and far away. The earliest gospel, Mark, was written 40 years after the events it depicts, and the other gospels are built upon this originally oral tradition. And each evangelist has a different version of what happened on that first Easter, but interestingly, all four gospels contain accounts of the empty tomb. Nobody knew what had become of Jesus' body, and the various stories of the empty tomb were different ways of interpreting that absence. So I want to explore this empty tomb with you this morning. I want to take it seriously, precisely as a symbol. I don't want to take it for granted or rush beyond it to cut to the chase of the resurrection, so to speak. I want to dwell with this original emptiness for a while, and I hope you'll join me. And I'm going to do it through the lens of, primarily through the lens of Eastern religion. It's just how it evolved for me. In the Western worldview, the one that we all ordinarily inhabit, emptiness is not usually thought of as a good thing. Emptiness is more of a negative concept. It represents mere absence, a lack, a vacancy, a void. Emptiness is imagined as a useless vacuum, hollow, blank, barren, depleted, a sheer nothingness, a simple waste of space. It's different in Eastern cultures and the Eastern religions. The Tao Te Ching, for example, speaks of the subtle but real power of emptiness in the passage that I read earlier. We work with the substantial, says Lao Tzu, but the emptiness is what we use. In the Buddhist tradition, the idea of emptiness has been developed into a sophisticated metaphysical concept known as sunyata. Sunyata is a Japanese term that's usually translated in English as emptiness, but it also carries the connotation of unobstructed clarity, of openness, and transparency might be a better translation. Seeing through appearances to the underlying truth and reality. In the Buddhist tradition, enlightenment consists of realizing this sunyata experientially. Seeing through the emptiness of the world this way results in an experience of liberation and a spontaneous lightness of being, leading to a spirit of boundless and open-hearted compassion. Perhaps a little Zen story can help convey this experience. Chono was a Buddhist monk and nun in Japan in the 13th century. She had studied for years and years, but she was unable to achieve enlightenment. And she was walking along one evening. She was carrying a pail of water. She was watching the full moon reflected in the water in the pail. And suddenly the bamboo strips that held the bucket together broke. And the pail fell apart, and instantly the water rushed out, and the moon's reflection disappeared. And in that moment, Chono became enlightened. Afterwards, she wrote a little poem to describe what had happened. This way and that way, I tried to keep the pail together, hoping the weak bamboo would never break. And suddenly, the bottom fell out. No more water, no more moon, emptiness in my hand. Of course, this is not just about the moon in a pail of water. It's about the ego floating on the surface of a deeper consciousness. And the transformative insight that came to Chinyono showed that the ego is as insubstantial, as empty as the reflected moon. The bottom drops out of experience, and we have nothing to cling to. This positive appreciation of emptiness has influenced Oriental aesthetics. Perhaps you've seen a Japanese rock garden in which the sandy negative space around just a few well-placed stones becomes as important as the stones themselves, or a delicate ink brush drawing which is mostly empty space. That gesture drawing of an open circle that was on screen at the end of the offertory was my rough attempt to express the meaning of the empty tomb in visual terms, an image of openness and emptiness seen together. Now, I'm not suggesting that the gospel writers were secret Buddhists smuggling Eastern metaphysical concepts into the stories. I am saying that Mark was, and the others were quite aware of what they were doing as they were constructing this literary narrative around the empty tomb. I'm quite sure that they had an experiential knowledge of emptiness in this positive sense as a fertile womb or ground out of which new possibilities of life and freedom emerge. That's what resurrection meant. It was not a separate thing or a single supernatural event. It was more like an encompassing atmosphere, the ultimate environment or reality within which the early Christians lived and moved and had their being. I'm reminded of a poem by Juan Ramon Jimenez called Ocean. He writes, "I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing. And nothing happens. Nothing. Silence. Waves. Nothing happens? Or has everything happened? And we are standing now quietly in the new life." The symbol of the empty tomb is a metaphorical condensation or crystallization of the Easter myth. The story of Easter, like the story of Passover, is a myth in the precise and proper sense of that word. Contrary to popular misunderstanding, a myth is not a false story, but a narrative that conveys the deepest possible truth. The Benedictine monk Sebastian Moore describes myth as the way we used to talk before we learned how to lie. Myth is a way of speaking truth. Joseph Campbell described myth as the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos flow into the soul. And I think the image of the empty tomb is precisely one such secret opening. I still vividly remember an encounter with this sacred emptiness that happened to me when I was a student chaplain at a Boston hospital more than 40 years ago. As part of our clinical pastoral training, we were required to view an autopsy being performed. It just so happened that this autopsy was scheduled for Holy Saturday, the very day when, in mythic dream time of the Easter story, Jesus lay in the tomb, or in some versions of the story, descended into the underworld. So as I descended into the hospital's basement morgue, along with my classmates and our supervisor, I didn't know exactly what I was expecting to find, but as I witnessed the autopsy, I recalled two biblical phrases that summed up my experience pretty well. The first was the psalmist's exclamation that we human beings are fearfully and wonderfully made. As I looked upon the incredibly beautiful, intricate complexity of the human body, I was astounded and amazed. I remember that the two doctors performing the autopsy were Jewish because they were talking quietly about going to a Passover Seder that evening. It was one of those years, like this year, when Passover and Easter closely coincided on the calendar. But there was nothing rushed as they went about their work, and there was no contradiction between their careful scientific exploration and description on the one hand, and a kind of deep reverence for the beauty of the human body and the dignity of the human being that had been awesomely and wonderfully made. The second biblical phrase came across as clearly as if an angel had whispered it into my ear. And indeed, it was the very same word that the angel in Mark's gospel speaks. He is not here. He is not here. Whoever this man had been, whatever had animated him, was gone. There's a well-known Buddhist mantra that stands at the conclusion of the Heart Sutra that describes the attainment of nirvana. It goes like this: gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate. And it means gone, gone, gone beyond, gone completely beyond. That's the positive, the ultimate goal of enlightenment, of nirvana in Buddhism. So this cadaver before me was utterly empty. He was gone. Now, don't misunderstand me by taking the word empty literally. I'm not talking about a cavity. All of his organs, every single one of them, was in place and intact. And as I said, beautifully complex and intricate, but he was totally gone. He wasn't there. But I was there. I was absolutely present and alive in the moment in a way that I had not known before. I was vividly aware of my own being, my own pulse, my breathing, the sweat trickling down my armpits, the sounds and odors and colors in the room. I was newly awakened to life, to the fullness of life. And this awareness was inseparable from my encounter with this emptiness. Now, that may seem like a fairly dramatic example of the contrast between being and non-being. A more typical experience of emptiness, perhaps, might be the disappointment that the writer Gertrude Stein expressed when she made a trip to Oakland, California. Upon arriving, she supposedly remarked that there was no there there. How do we react when there's no there there? When our expectations are upset or overturned? How is it when you enter an empty room or an empty house? Do you immediately turn on the television, check the fridge, occupy yourself, busily filling the space with activity? How do you feel when you have empty time on your hands? If someone cancels an appointment, for example, are you resentful, angry, frightened, perhaps bored? How do you deal with the openness of that moment? And it's perhaps natural to react with fear to these empty spaces, like the women confronted with the empty tomb. But if we can face and overcome this fear, we can even learn to cultivate emptiness deliberately. So we do just a bit of that in our worship services. This morning we had some, maybe even a little more generous time of silence around our meditation. What was that like? What was that emptiness like? Were you restless, bored? What comes up in that emptiness? What comes up in that emptiness? We can create open blocks of time in our calendars, whether that's just a few minutes a day set aside for meditation or a week-long retreat apart from the routine of our lives. we can open ourselves to new learning, which may require unlearning some of the things we think we know. There's a marvelous story, again from the Zen Buddhist tradition, about the learned professor who came to study meditation with Master Nan In. And Nan In, being a good host, served tea to his guest. And meanwhile, while he was doing that, the professor, who we would say was someone who was quite full of himself, he just kept talking on and on about his knowledge, everything he knew about Buddhism and what he was expecting and going to do and had done. And Nanin quietly kept pouring his tea into the visitor's cup until it was full, and then he just kept on pouring. And the professor watched as it overflowed until he could no longer contain himself. He said, "It's full, no more, we'll go in." And Nanin gently said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen until you first empty your cup?" So Zen practice, or any meditative practice, aims at emptying the cup in order to cultivate what is called beginner's mind. Beginner's mind is not uninformed or childish or naive, but it is marked by a kind of openness, curiosity, spontaneity, and a kind of grateful, wondering humility that allows us to be fully present and alive in each new moment. So I am brought back again and again to this simple and radical emptiness of the open tomb, or perhaps I should say the openness of the empty tomb. The discovery of this emptiness, this nothing where we expected something, upsets our expectations and drastically disorients our understanding until we find a new direction. In his wonderful essay on the structure of fairy tales, the J.R.R. Tolkien coined the term eucatastrophe, with the EU, the Greek word for good. It's also in the word evangelism, good news, good message. Eucatastrophe. He coined the term eucatastrophe to describe, and here I'm quoting him, that peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy literature, which can be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It's a sudden and joyous turn in the narrative world around a radical reversal. So there's this glimpse into the deep truth of things. It just occurs for a moment, perhaps, in the story. That's the eucatastrophe. And Tolkien, who was himself a devout Christian, considered the resurrection to be what he called the eucatastrophe par excellence in the story. It's a story. Frederick, the great theologian, just died this last year, and preacher Frederick Buechner had a classic book about preaching called Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. It's no trouble using that language in Tolkien's sense to understand the power of the story. But the Easter story transcends the boundaries and confines of this one day or of any one religious tradition. You might say that Easter is too important to be left to the Christians. I recall a story told to me by Carl Scoville, a retired minister and friend. He was at King's Chapel in Boston, one of our most distinguished UU Christian theologians. He was describing a retreat that he had made at the Benedictine Monastery in Spencer, Massachusetts. And when Carl was there, the monastery had invited as a guest a Zen master from Japan to share his teaching method, which involved the use of koans. Now, a koan is a kind of riddle or parable. It's a question that is intentionally designed to frustrate the rational and logical mind, to create a double bind which forces the student to make an intuitive leap that leads to a sudden insight into the nature of enlightenment, like Chiono in her water bucket, or like the parables of Jesus with their punchlines. The most famous koan, perhaps, is the What is the sound of one hand clapping? You've all probably heard that. If you haven't heard the one hand clapping, you've heard the question. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Huh? Another one of my favorites is, show me your original face. The one you had, the one that was yours before your parents were born. Show me that face. That's another koan. And no rote answer, even if it's generated by artificial intelligence, no rote answer will satisfy a genuine Zen master. So this was the situation that Carl faced when he entered the meditation room, where the teacher was sitting with 2 copies of the New Testament spread out in front of him, one in Japanese, one in English. He said, you know, I think I like your Christianity, but I would not like it without the resurrection. And then he paused and he leaned over until his face was 6 inches from Carl's face. And he said, show me your resurrection. Show me your resurrection. That is your koan. That is your koan. And it's our koan too. I think that's our challenge. As Unitarian Universalists, we draw upon many sources for our religious inspiration, including, and here I'm quoting the first source, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Sometimes we need help to roll away the stone impediments which block our access to these life-giving and life-sustaining forces. And that process of opening up that space, that empty space, that's resurrection, that unobstructed openness to the forces of life. The mythologist Joseph Campbell once said that people say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking, said Campbell. I think that what we are seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experience on the purely physical plane will have resonance with our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. That's what it's all about, finally. Even for the most skeptical and secular among us, Easter holds open the door to the possibility of a renewed encounter with the truth symbolized by the empty tomb, a truth that happens not once upon a time, but all the time. Every Sunday really can be a little Easter, but more than that, every day contains many moments, little openings and opportunities hidden in the most ordinary of places, like little lovely lavender eggs. May we open ourselves to such moments of transcending mystery and wonder in our lives. Amen and alleluia.